All right, time to finish the B deduction. Very excited. I just watched Professor Gijsbers' video explaining the last couple of sections, and I'm ready to go. All right, section 25. In the transcendental synthesis of the manifold of representations in general, on the contrary, and therefore, in the synthetic original unity of apperception, I am not conscious of myself as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself, but conscious only that I am. This representation is an act of thought, not of intuition. Now, in order to know ourselves, we require, besides the act of thought that brings the manifold of every possible intuition to the unity of apperception, also a determinate kind of intuition. Now, in order to know ourselves, we require, besides the act of thought that brings the manifold of every possible intuition to the unity of apperception, also a determinate kind of intuition, whereby this manifold is given to us. And thus, although my existence is not appearance, much less a mere illusion, the determination of my existence can only take place in conformity with the form of inner sense, and according to that special manner in which the manifold, which I combine, is given in inner intuition. Hold on, I missed a footnote. This is the end of... Now, in order to know... I'm going back a sentence. Now, in order to know ourselves, we require, besides the act of thought that brings the manifold of every possible intuition to the unity of apperception, also a determinate kind of intuition, whereby this manifold is given. And thus, although my own existence is not appearance, much less a mere illusion, the determination of my existence... Footnote. Middle of the sentence. And so I think what they're, based on Professor Gijsbers' lecture, I think what Kant is getting at is space and time, although a priori intuitions that present the aesthetic, are also themselves things that we have to, that are like subject to the synthesis. Well, I don't know if they're subject to the synthesis, but they are, in a way, independent things that we have to kind of frame in the same, that are also subject to the categories because they function, in the same way as things that are presented to us, like the actual objects, and therefore they must also, the categories must also apply to them, and therefore apply at the same time as the transcendental aesthetic is happening, type of thing. And you can't have the transcendental aesthetic without the application of the categories because of that. I think it's kind of the way Kant is bridging the gap between those two things. Footnote. The I think expresses the act of determining my own existence. What is thus given is the existence, but what is not yet given is the manner in which I am to determine it. That is, in which I am to posit within me the manifold belonging to it. In order for that manifold to be given, time is usually the inner manifold, right? Self-intuition is required. And such intuition depends on an a priori given form. In order for that manifold to be given, self-intuition is required. And such intuition depends on an a priori given form, that is, on time, which is sensible and belongs to our receptivity of what is determinable. If, then, I do not have another self-intuition, which likewise, before the act of determination, gives the that in me which determines. I am conscious only of the spontaneity of it. Just as time gives the determinable, I cannot determine my existence as that of a self-active being. Instead, I only represent myself, to myself, the spontaneity of my thought. That is, the act of determination. And my existence remains only sensibly determinable. That is, as the existence of an appearance. It is, however, on account of this spontaneity that I call myself an intelligence. That's what I call myself. Okay. I'm going to read that again. The I think expresses the act of determining my own existence. The act of determining, okay. What is thus given is the existence, but what is not yet given is the manner in which I am to determine it. So, like, my self-awareness gives me the fact that I exist. I think, therefore, I am. Maybe, I don't know. But it doesn't give the manner in which I am able to determine it, according to Kant. In which I am to posit within me the manifold belonging to it. Okay, so then you're positing the inner self, which is, in Kant's position, in order for that manifold to be given, meaning like the inner manifold of time, self-intuition is required. Okay? And such intuition depends on an a priori given form, that is, on time. Okay? And so the unity of the manifold is dependent on time? Is that what he's saying? And because the unity of the manifold applies to categories, like time is a necessary component of that, therefore the categories also apply to time. That kind of thing? Which is sensible and belongs to our receptivity of what is determinable. Okay. If then I do not have another self-intuition, which likewise, before the act of determination, gives that in me which determines, I am conscious only of the spontaneity of it. Just as time gives the determinable, I cannot determine my existence as that of a self-active being. Instead, I only represent to myself the spontaneity of my thought, that is, of the act of determination, and my existence remains only sensibly determinable, that is, as the existence of an appearance. Right, okay. It is, however, on account of this spontaneity that I call myself an intelligence. This shows that I have no knowledge... Back up to the body, sorry. And the end of that sentence. This shows that I have no knowledge of myself as I am, but only as I appear to myself. The consciousness of oneself is therefore very far from being a knowledge of oneself. Oh, I understand. Well, I don't know if I understand, but that kind of makes sense. Meaning, like, for, consciousness is just the awareness of something, right? So being aware of myself, all it takes is kind of just, I don't know, intuition of myself. But Kant has taken the position here that intuition is not sufficient for knowledge, obviously. So knowledge of myself, and therefore like knowledge of things presumably like time and space, which we now understand, according to Kant, are a priori intuitions. Knowledge is way different than just an intuition or an experience. It requires, as we've been talking about, it requires some sort of intuition / experience that is fed through some sort of synthesis, through the logic, and then through the logic, through the categories, at some point it is synthesized, and then we are able to have knowledge on the other end of that. And so Kant is saying experience of myself is the consciousness of myself is not the same as knowledge of myself. And if I have knowledge of myself, which requires underlying space and time being a priori, which is part of our knowledge right now, then it must be that the categories apply to them, because otherwise we couldn't have knowledge of them. I think? Is that what he's getting at? Okay. This shows that I have no knowledge of myself as I am, but only as I appear to myself. The consciousness of oneself is therefore very far from being a knowledge of oneself, in spite of all the categories which constitute the thought of an object in general, by means of the combination of the manifold in one apperception. Just as for the knowledge of an object, different from myself, I require, besides the thinking of an object in general, in a category, also an intuition, by which I determine that general concept. So for the knowledge of myself I require, besides consciousness of myself or the fact that I think myself, also an intuition of the manifold in me, by which I determine that thought. Besides consciousness of myself, or the fact that I think myself, also an intuition of the manifold in me, by which I determine that thought. I exist, therefore, as a kind of intelligence which is conscious solely of its faculty of combination. Okay. But with respect to the manifold that has to be combined, this intelligence is subjected to a limiting condition, which it calls inner sense. This intelligence is subjected to a limiting condition, which it calls inner sense, according to which this combination can only become intuitable in relations of time, which lie entirely outside the concepts of the understanding. Such an intelligence, therefore, can only know itself as it appears to itself in regard to an intuition, okay, because it can't know it outside of time, which cannot be intellectual, right, and given by the understanding itself, and not as it would know itself if its intuition were intellectual. That's kind of what I thought he was getting at in the parentheses, but okay, that makes sense. All right, big paragraph coming up, 26, or big section rather. Probably many paragraphs. Actually, I don't think it's that long. Well, at least I think it's like chopped up into different sections, although they're not numbered. Okay, 26. Transcendental deduction of the universally possible use of the pure concepts of the understanding of experience. Transcendental deduction, right, that's what we've been doing, of the universally possible use of the pure concepts of the understanding in experience. Okay, let's roll. In the metaphysical deduction of the categories, their a priori origin was proved through their complete agreement with the universal logical functions of thought, says you. While in the transcendental deduction we established that their possibility as a priori knowledge of objects of an intuition in general. Okay. Now we have to explain the possibility of knowing a priori through categories whatever objects may come before our senses. I really need to reread. Reread everything. Not everything, but like I need to reread from the categories to here. How long? That's like 50 pages again. It's fine. Maybe I'll try to do that. That'll give me something to read off camera. Well, off microphone. Okay. Now we have to explain the possibility of knowing a priori through categories whatever objects may come before our senses. Not indeed with respect to the form of their intuition, but with respect to the laws of their combination. and thus the possibility of prescribing, as it were, laws to nature, nay, of even making nature possible. Okay, now we have to explain the possibility of knowing a priori through the categories whatever objects may become, not indeed with respect to the form of their intuition, because we already know that space and time, right? But with respect to the laws of their combination. So we want to know the laws of combination, baby. Alright, here we go. And thus the possibility of prescribing, as it were, laws to nature. Because if it applies to, like, combination of stuff, it applies to, like, all objects as we experience them, so it must apply to nature. Of even making nature possible. Unless they were adequate to that purpose, we cannot understand how everything that may come before our senses must be subject to laws, which have their origin a priori in the understanding alone. Hear, hear. First of all, I may remark that by the synthesis of apprehension, I understand that combination of the manifold is an empirical intuition. Combination of the manifold is an empirical intuition, by which perception, that is, empirical consciousness of the intuition, becomes possible. Okay. We have in our representations of space and time forms of outer as well as inner sensible intuition a priori. And to these, the synthesis of apprehension, and to these, the synthesis of the apprehension of the manifold of appearance must always conform to space and time. Right, okay. Because it can take place only according to that form. Agree. Time and space, however, are represented a priori, and this is like the big deal right here. Time and space, however, are represented a priori, not merely as forms of sensible intuition, but also as themselves intuitions containing a manifold, and therefore are represented with the determination of the unity of this manifold in them, but also as themselves intuitions containing a manifold, and therefore are represented with the determination of the unity of this manifold in them. Right. So space and time are like the form of everything, like, and you know, qua forms, but they also actually contain the manifold that is presented to us, like, in actuality, not just a priori, if that makes sense. I'm struggling a little, because didn't he say that time and space don't actually exist without our function? But I guess he would say, yeah, I'm not saying they would exist without our participation here either, but that doesn't mean that they can't exist through our experience as actual things. But he's saying, like, the Newtonian idea that they just would exist independently of us is not a thing. And so this is just a further extrapolation of what it means for it to exist to us. Okay. Thanks, Kant. Okay. Therefore, even the unit... Wait, I missed a footnote. There's a footnote right there. Important footnote. Alert. Space represented as object, as required in geometry, contains more than mere form of intuition, namely also the comprehension of the manifold given, according to the form of sensibility, into an intuitive representation. The comprehension of the manifold given, according to the form of sensibility, into an intuitive representation. Okay. Meaning, like, space and time, like, present stuff to us in actuality, so that the form of intuition gives only a manifold, while the formal intuition gives unity of representation. In the aesthetic, I had simply ascribed this unity to sensibility, but now I'm like, it's you know, actually there. In the aesthetic, I had simply ascribed this unity to sensibility, in order to show that it precedes any concept, though it presupposes a synthesis not belonging to the senses, and through which all concepts of space and time become first of all possible. For as by this synthesis, the understanding determining sensibility, space and time are first given as intuitions. The unity of this a priori intuition belongs to space and time, and not to the concept of understanding. Okay. So space and time not only are a priori forms which make up our experience, they are also, excuse me, the unity of the manifold that we're presented with also belongs to space and time in reality. Not just as forms, but as actual, as the actual unity that we are, of the manifold that we are presented with. And again, I think the point he's making, and he's going to do the same kind of turn that he did with the deduction earlier, where the categories, he's established the categories apply to experience somehow. And then if space and time are part of the unity of the manifold that is our experience, then space and time have to kind of simultaneously apply to the categories as well. Which effectively means that like the transcendental aesthetic is not some different separate part of our experience that is separate and apart from the categories and is then applied to then once it at a certain point our experience, when it's combined with the understanding, becomes the categories eventually apply to them. Rather, like, the categories apply to experience and space and time from the get-go. Okay. Sorry, I have kind of a cold, and I just woke up a little while ago, trying to not to cough. Sometimes I just cough directly into the mic, and I'm like, what are you doing, man? Therefore, even unity of the synthesis of the manifold, without or within us, and consequently also a combination, to which everything that is to be represented as determined in space and time must conform, is already given a priori as the condition of the synthesis of all apprehension, simultaneously with these intuitions, not in them. Okay, I think I get it. The synthetic unity can be no other than that of the combination. Synthetic unity can be no other than that of the combination in accordance with the categories, but applied to our sensible intuition of the manifold of a given intuition in general, in an original consciousness. Consequently, all synthesis, even that through which perception becomes possible, is subject to the categories. All synthesis is subject to the categories. And as experience is knowledge through connected perceptions, the categories are conditions of the possibility of experience, and therefore valid a priori also for all objects of experience. We did it. Alright, I'm going to reread that whole paragraph. We have in our representations of space and time forms of the outer as well as the inner sensible intuition a priori. And to these, the synthesis of the apprehension of the manifold of appearance must always conform, because it can take place only according to that form. Got it. This is all transcendental aesthetic stuff. Time and space, however, are represented a priori, not merely as forms of sensible intuition, but also as themselves intuitions, containing a manifold. So time and space also contain the manifold. They're not just forms. They don't... Okay, whatever. was going to say forms don't necessarily seem like antithetical to them being intuitions and containing the manifold. Meaning, like, my understanding of the form is like that it is the underlying basis and therefore contains the manifold. But anyway. And therefore are represented with the determination of the unity of this manifold in them. Meaning, the unity of the manifold, our experience, is represented with that unity in mind. The unity of space and time holding or connecting, being presented simultaneously with the matter within it. Okay, C, the transcendental aesthetic. Okay, I'm going to read the footnote again. I kind of want to skip over it, but I'm not going to. Space, represented as object, as required in geometry, contains more than mere form of intuition, namely, also the comprehension of the manifold given according to the form of sensibility into an intuitive representation, so that the form of intuition gives only a manifold, while the formal intuition gives unity of representation. So the formal intuition, that's like what's presented to us, whereas the form of intuition is just, a priori or a priori idea of like what space is as underlying everything as a form. Okay. In the aesthetic, I had simply ascribed this unity to sensibility. Right, he was just talking about sensibility, but now he's talking about the understanding as well. In order to show that it precedes any concept. But it doesn't precede any concept. I guess the form of it does, but not necessarily the formal intuition of it does. Okay. Though it presupposes a synthesis not belonging to the senses, and through which all concepts of space and time become first of all possible. For as by this synthesis, the understanding determining sensibility, space and time are first given as intuitions. The unity of this a priori intuition belongs to space and time, and not to the concept of the understanding. Okay. Therefore, even unity of the synthesis of the manifold without or within us, and consequently also a combination to which everything that is to be represented as determined in space and time must conform, is already given a priori as the condition of the synthesis of all apprehension, simultaneously with these intuitions, not in them. Okay. This synthetic unity can be no other than that of the combination in accordance with the categories, but applied to our sensible intuition of the manifold of a given intuition in general, in an original consciousness. Consequently, all synthesis, even that through which perception becomes possible, is subject to the categories. And as experience is knowledge through connected perceptions. The categories are conditions of the possibility of experience and are therefore valid a priori also for all objects of experience. All right. Okay. If, for instance, I turn the empirical intuition of a house through the apprehension of the intuition's manifold into a perception, the necessary unity of space and of outer sensible intuition in general lies at the basis of this apprehension, and I draw, as it were, the shape of the house according to this synthetic unity of the manifold in space. I draw, as it were, the shape of the house according to this synthetic unity of the manifold in space. Okay. But this very synthetic unity, if I make abstraction from the form of space, has its seat in the understanding, and is in fact the category of the synthesis of the homogeneous in an intuition in general, that is, the category of quantity. I could use more examples of what the fuck he's talking about, so this is helpful. But this very synthetic unity, if I make abstraction from the form of space, has its seat in the understanding, and is in fact the category of the synthesis of the homogeneous in an intuition in general, that is, the category of quantity. To this category, therefore, the synthesis of apprehension, that is, the perception, must conform throughout. Okay. Footnote. In this manner, it is proved that the synthesis of apprehension, which is empirical, must necessarily conform to the synthesis of apperception, which is intellectual and contained in the category entirely a priori. It is one and the same spontaneity, which there, under the name of imagination, and here, under the name of understanding, brings combination into the manifold of intuition. Okay, I'm lost. If, for instance, I turn the empirical intuition of a house, empirical intuition of a house, like my actual empirical experience of a house, through the apprehension of the intuition's manifold into a perception. So it's now a perception. The necessary unity of space and of outer sensibility and of outer sensible intuition in general lies at the basis of this apprehension. Okay. And I draw, as it were, the shape of the house according to this synthetic unity of the manifold of space. But this, I'm kind of struggling. Is he picturing this in his mind's eye, or is he actually experiencing the house? But I think what he's done is he's turned the empirical intuition, the actual experience of the house, into a mere perception. But perception would be perceiving the house empirically, so I think what he's saying is like perception of the house would be like in his mind's eye, like in his, which would still kind of function under the categories because quantity, there's one house. Okay. And, as it were, the shape of the house according to this synthetic unity of the manifold of space. Okay, but he's drawing on that synthetic unity of the manifold of space in order to have this perception of the house. But this very synthetic unity, if I make abstraction from the form of space, has its seat in the understanding, okay? And is in fact the category of the synthesis of the homogeneous in an intuition in general, that is, the category of quantity. To this category, therefore, the synthesis of apprehension, that is, the perception, must conform throughout. Okay. Footnote, again. In this manner, it is proved that the synthesis of apprehension, right, which is empirical, right, must necessarily conform to the synthesis of apperception, which is intellectual. Okay, and the synthesis of apperception is my recognition that I am synthesizing something and holding it within the unity, myself, consciousness, which is intellectual and contained in the category entirely a priori. Okay, so experience must conform to the synthesis of apprehension, obviously, because we're experiencing it, and that's empirical, but it also, because we can use that to make just a perception in our head, it must the empirical perception must also apply to the apperception, which is our recognition that we are holding the experience in our mind. I'm not sure. Okay. In this manner, it is proved that the synthesis of apprehension, which is empirical, must necessarily conform to the synthesis of apperception, which is intellectual and contained in the category entirely a priori. It is one and the same spontaneity, which there, under the name imagination, and here, under the name spontaneity, brings combination into the manifold of intuition. Okay. I don't know if I understand, but effectively, like, our actual experience of the house requires a synthesis of apprehension, right? We are experiencing it, and we synthesize that experience into something that becomes, doesn't become, it's simultaneously a synthesis of apperception, because all of this stuff is contained within a unity, us, and we are able to use that to make concepts and to make perceptions. So therefore, I'm not really sure. The experience of it must categories must apply to the experience of it, and the categories also definitely apply to the subsequent concepts in the understanding. But the experience we wouldn't have any use of or access to the experience, I guess, without it funneling through the understanding, and therefore the categories must apply to the experience as well. I don't know. I'm not really there. I'm not really there. I mean, honestly, this example is more confusing than the original stuff. Okay. Or, if to take another example. Okay, we got another example. Great. I perceive the freezing of water. I apprehend two states, that of fluidity and that of solidity. Okay, I got it. Water. I understand water. Maybe. And these as standing to each other in a relation of time. Okay, at one time it was fluid, one time it was solid. But in time, which I use as the foundation of the appearance as inner intuition, I necessarily represent to myself synthetic unity of the manifold. Without which, but in time, which I use as the foundation of the appearance as inner intuition, I necessarily represent to myself synthetic unity of the manifold, without which that relation of time could not be given determinately in an intuition. Right. I couldn't have that synthetic unity of water turning into ice in my mind without that, without time, because it's two different states and they appear sequentially. Okay. In respect to the succession of time. This synthetic unity, however, as a priori condition under which I combine the manifold of the intuition in general, right, turns out to be, if I abstract from the constant form of my inner intuition, namely from time, the category of cause. Oh, and this is a category in the understanding, through which, if I apply it to my sensibility, I determine everything that happens in terms of its relation, and do so in time in general. Thus, the apprehension of such an event, and the event itself as regards possible perception, is subject to the concept of the relation of cause and effects, meaning one of the categories. The same applies to all other cases. Okay. So he's taking specific examples and saying, even if I were to, so the ice example, water changes into ice. Like, there's a necessarily temporal component of that, because it is something changing, and it can't be both things at the same time. And even if it were both things at the same time, that they're, the whole point is that it changed from fluid to ice. So we have to experience them sequentially, and therefore, obviously, the inner sense or time applies to it. And what he's saying is, he's effectively proving that the categories are in some way not duplicative of, but that time can be put into one of the categories. So he's saying okay, if let's take time out of that completely and just talk about our experience of that and our understanding of it. And if you look at our understanding is probably a better word, our understanding of how that occurs, we can apply one of the categories here as effectively a substitute for time. And in the abstract, since the categories, or maybe since time doesn't have to apply in the abstract, we can get there kind of conceptually as to that cause and effect, that change. But if we abstract time away, okay, so if we abstract time away, we can do that. But as far as experience goes, we can't abstract time away. And time effectively falls into the bucket of the understanding of that cause and effect. And that shows, I don't know, I just don't know, why does that show that the categories actually apply to time as opposed to, I don't know. Effectively, he's just pointing to one of the categories and saying, like, I don't know, I thought I had it for a second, but I don't think I do. But he's saying, like, one of the categories in this situation, we can abstract away from the actual intuition of it and experience of it and apply one of the categories. But that effectively means, I guess, that if we don't abstract from time, then time would apply, this category would apply to time, because that's how we get knowledge of it. And just seeing things, like the experience of things in time, would not be sufficient to actually get knowledge of that thing. I don't know, something like that. I'm going to have to reread this probably 20 times. Okay. Categories are concepts which prescribe laws a priori to appearances. Okay. And therefore to nature as the sum total of all appearances. Natura materialiter spectata, Latin. The question therefore arises, since the categories are not derived from nature, and do not conform to it as their model, in which case they would be merely empirical, how do we understand the fact that nature must conform to them? That is, how they can determine a priori the combination of the manifold of nature without taking that combination from nature? Good question. The solution of this riddle is this. I'm sure it's very straightforward. It is no more surprising that the laws of appearances in nature must agree with the understanding and its a priori form, that is, with its faculty of combining the manifold in general, than that the appearances themselves must agree with the form of a priori sensible intuition. For laws exist just as little in appearances, but only relative to the subject to which, insofar as it has understanding, the appearances belong, as appearances do not exist in themselves, but only relative to the same being, insofar as it has the sense as it has senses. Okay. Things in themselves would necessarily have their lawfulness, even independently of the understanding that knows them. So effectively, like, what we have is, we have laws that come from within us, like the categories, the logic, etc. Maybe not etc. That maybe that's fucking everything. And the only thing we can apply that to is appearances. We can't apply it to things in themselves. And therefore, kind of definitionally, like, since we have figured this out basically from appearances, our understanding and those laws that we have within the understanding apply to nature, because that is our experience, those appearances. And this is all the stuff we figured out. So they kind of have to, if they coexist, then they have to, like, follow the laws. And the understanding has to conform to, like, those appearances as well. But this is more just of a things in themselves, appearances dichotomy, as opposed to, like, the laws actually apply to anything in the world thing. It seems to me, at least. Things in themselves would necessarily have their lawfulness, even independently of an understanding that knows them. But appearances are only the representations of things that are unknown as to what they may be in themselves. As mere representations, they are subject to no law of connection, except that which is prescribed it by the connecting faculty. Now that which connects the manifold of sensible intuition is the imagination, which depends on the understanding with respect to the unity of its intellectual synthesis, and on sensibility with respect to the manifoldness of apprehension. Yes. Thus, as all possible perception depends on the synthesis of apprehension, and this synthesis itself, this empirical synthesis, depends on the transcendental synthesis, and therefore on the categories, it follows that all possible perceptions, and hence also everything whatever that can come to the empirical consciousness, that is, all appearances of nature, must, as far as their combination is concerned, be subject to the categories. Right, everything depends on one another. I'm going to read that again just because it's long. Thus, all possible perception depends on the synthesis of apprehension. And this synthesis itself... Wait, so all possible perception depends on the synthesis of apprehension. Right. That is like, I don't know, the alpha and omega of our perception. Because it's like only insofar as we understand things and are able to synthesize them. And this synthesis itself, this empirical synthesis, depends on the transcendental synthesis, and therefore on the categories. Okay? That's our like possibility of potential synthesis, and that is limited to the categories. Okay? It follows that all possible perceptions, and hence also everything whatever that can come to the empirical consciousness, that is, all appearances of nature, must, as far as their combination is concerned, be subject to the categories. Okay? That makes sense. Nature, considered as nature in general, depends on the categories as the original ground of its necessary lawfulness. Beyond the laws underlying nature in general, as a lawfulness of appearances in space and time, even the pure faculty of the understanding is incapable of prescribing, through mere categories, a priori laws to appearances. Special laws, what are you talking about, Kant? Therefore special laws, therefore, because they refer to appearances which are determined empirically, cannot be completely derived from the categories, although they are all subject to them. Experience must be added in order for us to know such special laws at all. But the a priori laws alone inform us with regard to experience in general, and about what can be known as an object of experience. Okay. Section 27. So we finished section 26. I need to reread stuff. I'm a little annoyed at my lack of understanding. I know this is challenging, but I don't know. It's just that frustration when you're really trying to learn something and you're just not getting it. Anyway, we're close. I think I might go read the Gardner book after this. Results of this deduction of the concepts of the understanding. We cannot think an object except through the categories. We cannot know an object that is thought except through intuitions corresponding to those objects. This is kind of a summary, I think. Now all our intuitions are sensible, and this knowledge, insofar as its object is given, is empirical. But empirical knowledge is experience, and therefore no a priori knowledge is possible to us, except only of objects of possible experience. It seems like a paradox almost. If it's a priori, it's okay. But I think what he's saying is our ideas of what happens a priori, probably both through the transcendental aesthetic and through the deduction, are possible to us only to the extent that they explain our experience, our actual experience. Because, like, that's the grounding of them. Like, we have to... But then again, like, if that's true, then aren't they kind of empirical a little bit? Okay, anyway. Not necessarily, because we can know stuff before we actually experience it, without having to experience it. Even if we, then use experience to confirm or understand those a priori thoughts, ideas, concepts, arguments, whatever. This knowledge, however, though limited to objects of experience, is not, therefore, all derived from experience. For both pure intuitions and pure concepts of the understanding are elements of knowledge which are found in us a priori. Both pure intuitions and the pure concepts of the understanding are elements of knowledge which are found in us a priori. Now... Oh, fuck, I missed a goddamn footnote. Son of a bitch. Okay. Let's go back. We cannot think an object... This is the beginning of 27. We cannot think an object through categories, except through categories. We cannot know an object that is thought, except through intuitions corresponding to those concepts. Right? Thoughts without intuition are meaningless. Intuitions without concepts are blind. Whatever this dumb thing. I should probably write that down. Now all our intuitions are sensible. And this knowledge, insofar as its object is given, is empirical. Yeah, okay. But empirical knowledge is experience. Empirical knowledge is experience. And therefore no a priori knowledge is possible to us except only of objects of possible experience. Okay. Footnote. Lest anybody should be unnecessarily frightened by the dangerous consequences of this proposition, I shall only remark that in our thinking, the categories are not limited by the conditions of our sensible intuition, but have really an unlimited field. It is only the knowledge of that which we think, the determining of an object, that requires intuition. And even in the absence of intuition, the thought of an object... Wait, hold on. I shall only remark that in our thinking... I was just kind of reading and not following. The categories are not limited by the conditions of our sensible intuition. Okay? But have really an unlimited field. Okay? Categories are awesome. And like, there may be things that we have not thought of or can't experience that the categories actually apply to. It is only the knowledge of that which we think, the determining of an object, that requires intuition. Okay? And even in the absence of intuition, the thought of the object may still have its true and useful consequences, as far as the subject's use of reason is concerned. This use of reason, however, as it is not always directed to the determination of an object, that is, to knowledge, but also to the determination of the subject and its volition, cannot be treated of here. Okay. Lest anybody should be necessarily frightened by the dangerous consequences of this proposition, I shall remark that in our thinking, the categories are not limited by the conditions of our sensible intuition, but have a really unlimited field. Okay. It is only the knowledge of that which we think, knowledge, the determining of an object, that requires intuition. Right. Like I said, the concepts about whatever is whatever. And even in the absence of intuition, the thought of an object may still have its true and useful consequences. As far as the subject's use of reason is concerned, I think he's kind of carving out the possibility of like, okay, I don't have the ability to intuit certain things, so is knowledge of them completely inaccessible? Like, can I not know things about God? Probably not, but Can I not know things about, I don't know, abstract concepts that I can't actually reach out and grab? And he's saying, yeah, you can use reason to do that, but what I'm really talking about here is like knowledge of objects. And we can still use reason to understand other stuff, because the categories apply to everything. Okay, I think I'm kind of makes sense. This knowledge, however, back to the body, sorry. This knowledge, however, though limited to objects of experience, makes sense, like we said, is not therefore all derived from experience. For both the pure intuitions and the pure concepts of the understanding are elements of knowledge which are found in us a priori. Now there are only two ways in which a necessary agreement of experience makes the concepts possible, or these concepts make experience possible. The former does not take place with respect to the categories, nor to pure sensible intuition, for they are a priori concepts, and therefore independent of experience. To ascribe to them an empirical origin would be to admit a kind of generatia equivoca. There remains, therefore, only the second alternative. I don't know what the fuck he's talking about. What's the first alternative? Pure intuitions and pure concepts. There are only two ways in which, I'm going back, in which a necessary agreement of experience with the concepts of its objects can be conceived. Experience makes these concepts possible, or these concepts make experience possible. Can't they both be true? I thought that was the point, Kant. I thought that was your big point. The former does not take place with respect to the categories. Former. Fucking. I hate when people do this. Okay, former, which would be experience makes these concepts possible. Yeah, the former does not take place with regard to the categories, nor to pure sensible intuition, for they are a priori concepts, and therefore independent of experience. Okay, therefore, experience doesn't make these concepts possible. For the categories and for these a priori stuff. There remains, therefore, only the second alternative, a system, as it were, of the epigenesis of pure reason, namely the categories, on the part of the understanding, contain the grounds of the possibility of all experience in general. Okay, how they render experience possible, and what principles of the possibility of experience they supply us with, when applied appearances, will be shown more fully in the following chapter. Okay, cool. On the transcendental use of the power of judgment. I kind of feel like this is one of those books. I mean, maybe this is just philosophy, like this high level of philosophy in general, but like I feel like I'm not going to understand a lot of this stuff until I just finish most of the book, or like finish all the relevant parts of this. Okay. Someone might propose to adopt a middle way between the two, namely that the categories are never self-thought a priori, first principles of our knowledge, nor derived from experience, but subjective dispositions of thought, implanted in us with our existence, and so arranged by our Creator that their use should accurately harmonize the laws of nature which determine the course of experience. Sounds pretty good. Besides the Creator part, I can get on board with that. I think a kind of pre-formation system of pure reason. But the following is a decisive objection against the middle course, apart from the objection that there would be no end to such a hypothesis, so that no one could know how far the presupposition of predetermined dispositions to future judgments might be. So fucking what? Tough shit, Kant. That's the way it works. I'm not saying that, but like, so what? So we couldn't know something, like wouldn't be the first time, or couldn't know the full extent of something. That the categories would then lose that necessity which is essential to the concept of them. Yeah, I remember Victor Gijsbers, or Professor Gijsbers, talking about this. That the categories would then lose that necessity which is essential to the concept of them. Thus, the concept of cause, which asserts the necessity of a result under a presupposed condition, would become false if it rested only on some subjective necessity, arbitrarily implanted in us, of connecting certain empirical representations according to a rule of causal relation. Like, so what? So what? That doesn't mean it's not true, because it would ruin your table of categories. I should not then be able to say that the effect is connected with the cause. I should not be able to say that the effect is connected with the cause in the object, that is, by necessity, but only that I am so constituted that I cannot think this representation as connected in any other way. Okay, so what? Again, this is exactly what the skeptic most desires. Maybe I'm a skeptic. For in that case, all our insight resting on the supposed objective validity of our judgments is nothing but mere illusion. Maybe it is. Nor would there be a lack of people who would say that they know nothing of such subjective necessity, which must be felt. And at all events, we could not quarrel with anybody about what depends merely on the manner in which his subject is organized. Okay, I mean, that's the end of the section. Okay, I guess that's what we're going to do next section. Maybe. That's what he said, right? Okay, brief outline of this deduction. All right, let's kick our feedback time and soak it in. Okay, this deduction presents the pure concepts of the understanding, and with them of all theoretical a priori knowledge, as principles of the possibility of experience, and presents experience as the determination of appearances in space and time in general. And presents experience as the determination of appearances in space and time in general. And lastly, presents this determination from the principle of the original synthetic unity of apperception, as the form of the understanding in reference to space and time. The original forms of sensibility. Okay, hold on. I'm going to take this slower. The deduction presents the pure concepts of the understanding, and with them, of all theoretical a priori knowledge, as principles of the possibility of experience. Right. Okay. He's talking about the category. No, the category. Well, I don't know. I don't know what he's talking about. But effectively, it presents the full panoply of possible a priori knowledge related to our understanding. So I guess that would be the categories. And thereby the logic, too. And experience. And presents experience as the determination of appearances in space and time in general. Right. And lastly, presents this I'm trying to get to where, like, trying to get to how that, again, so space and time are a priori intuitions, but they also actually are one with our actual experience of appearances, and therefore, since we must take that information and synthesize it, and then it becomes one in the unity of apperception, then space and time must, and since those things apply, the logic applies to them, and therefore the categories, then the categories apply to space and time just as much as they apply to experience. Anyway, and lastly, presents this determination from the principle of the original synthetic unity of apperception, as the form of the understanding in reference to space and time, the original forms of sensibility. Okay, final paragraph of the deduction, B deduction. I consider the division into two paragraphs to be necessary only up to here. Oh, did Kant put the A and B deduction next to each other? Because we have been treating of the elementary... Wait, what is he talking about? I consider the division into paragraphs to be necessary only up to here, because we have been treating of the elementary concepts. Now that we want to present their use, the treatise may proceed continuously without such division. Does he just mean the star paragraphs? I know what the hell he's talking about. Okay. Alright, so that's the B deduction. I'm going to go ahead and read the Gardner explanation of it and see what I can get there, and then maybe re-review some stuff, because I'm still pretty fuzzy, especially on the application of the categories. That's kind of my biggest hang-up. Because I get to that point, and I start to lose the thread. So anyway, but yeah, that's the second part of the B deduction, and next we'll move on to the analytic of principles, whatever the hell that is.